In the aftermath of World War I, America was ready to change. Soldiers returned home, cities grew louder, cars filled the streets, and technology buzzed with new energy. Ideas brought voices into the home. Electricity lit up neighborhoods, skyscrapers climbed into the clouds. It was the beginning of what would become the Roaring '20s, a decade of fast living, bold ambition, and deep transformation. The 1920s weren't just a party, they were a construction site. Real estate became one of the most powerful reflections of the nation's changing identity. As the economy roared and money flowed, housing exploded. New homes, new styles, new cities, everything felt possible. Land was no longer just land. It was opportunity, it was investment, it was the foundation for the American dream, and millions of people rushed to build their piece of it. But like all booms, this one had its flaws. It wasn't just about progress, it was about profit. And under all the glitter and optimism, pressure was quietly building. Some cities expanded too quickly. Some developers promised more than they could deliver. And while homeowners celebrated, renters protested. While some communities grew, others were systematically excluded. The real estate story of the 1920s is one of both creation and collapse, of belief and betrayal. In this video, we're going to take a close look at what real estate really looked like in the 1920s. We'll walk through the booming suburbs, downtown skyscrapers, and the sun-soaked plots of Florida land. We'll meet the early real estate agents, the hopeful homeowners, the frustrated tenants, and the investors who bet big and lost even bigger. We'll see how mortgages worked, how neighborhoods were designed, and how housing was sold to the public, often with big promises and very little caution. We'll also explore what wasn't advertised, the segregation baked into the deeds, the tenants who organized rent strikes, the ways in which real estate became a force not just for shelter, but for control, wealth, and power. And finally, we'll look at how the crash of 1929 brought it all to a halt, and what that collapse tells us about the fragile line between growth and greed. This is the real estate story of the 1920s, bigger, bolder, riskier, and more influential than you might expect. By the early 1920s, the American economy was running hot. Industrial production surged, stock prices climbed, wages increased. For many families, this decade brought the first real sense of financial freedom they had ever experienced. The trauma of the Great War was replaced by a hunger for stability, prosperity, and modern comforts. People didn't just want to work, they wanted to live. They wanted radios in the living room, plumbing in the bathroom, and kitchens with electric stoves. They wanted homes that looked different from their parents' generation, homes with garages for their Model Ts, homes with space for the latest conveniences. Cities were swelling fast. Between 1920 and 1930, America's urban population grew by over 15 million people. Chicago, Detroit, Los Angeles, and New York saw new waves of migration, with people arriving not just from rural areas, but from across the ocean. Immigration, despite new restrictions, continued to feed the urban labor force, and that labor force needed places to live. Developers responded by building quickly and with confidence. Urban blocks were filled with walk-up apartments, townhomes, and in wealthier areas, towering residences. Skyscrapers weren't just for business, they were becoming places to live. Buildings stretched higher, housing more people on less land. Places like Manhattan, construction never seemed to stop. Steel frames rose against the skyline as cement was poured and windows installed. Meanwhile, public transportation expanded. Subways and streetcars made it easier to live farther from work, which helped spread demand beyond downtown and into the growing outer boroughs and suburbs. These changes reflected a new rhythm in American life. People were no longer tied to farmland or factory towns. They could live in neighborhoods built around speed, light, and upward mobility. Urban real estate was not just a necessity, it was a statement. It showed that you had arrived, that you were modern, that you were part of the future. But not everyone benefited equally. The rush to urbanize came with overcrowding, rising rents, and speculative pricing that made many areas unaffordable to working-class families. Even as the skyline rose, so did inequality. And while the economy soared, few people questioned how long the boom would last or who might be left behind when it ended. As cities expanded and grew more crowded, many Americans began looking for something different. They wanted space, wanted quiet. They wanted to leave behind the smoke and congestion of downtown life without losing access to opportunity. This desire gave rise to one of the most influential trends of the 1920s, the birth of the American suburb as we know it today. Suburban living wasn't new, but during the 1920s it became newly accessible. The rise of the automobile played a huge role. Owning a car meant you no longer had to live near a streetcar line or train stop. You could live farther out and drive yourself in. This opened up entire tracts of land that had previously been too remote for housing development. Developers began buying up farmland just outside major cities and turning it into carefully planned neighborhoods. These were often advertised as cleaner, safer, and more wholesome alternatives to the city. The promise was clear. You could still be part of the modern world while raising a family in peace and comfort. The homes themselves reflected new ideas about how people wanted to live. The most popular style was the bungalow. These one-story homes were efficient, affordable, and easy to build. They featured front porches, built-in cabinetry, and open floor plans. Other popular styles included Colonial Revival, Tudor, and Spanish Revival, depending on the region and the target market. Mass production methods also began to change how homes were built. Companies like Sears sold kit homes through mail-order catalogs. A buyer could choose a design, and every piece of the house would be shipped by rail to their lot, ready to assemble. It was a revolutionary idea that helped standardize construction and reduce costs. These new neighborhoods were often designed with uniformity in mind. Rows of nearly identical houses lined curved streets. Yards were trimmed, driveways were poured. It was a vision of controlled beauty and predictable growth. And for many Americans, especially first-time buyers, it felt like the future. But the growth of the suburbs also deepened social divides. Most of these developments were marketed exclusively to white buyers. Racially restrictive covenants were common, written directly into property deeds. These rules banned Black, Asian, Jewish, and other minority families from buying homes in many suburban areas. The dream of suburban life was real for some, but intentionally out of reach for others. In the 1920s, home financing entered a new era. Before this decade, buying a home usually meant paying in full or negotiating directly with the seller for short-term credit. Mortgages were uncommon and often difficult to obtain. But during the 1920s, that began to change in a big way. Banks and lenders started to see real estate as a safer, more profitable space for long-term investment. As a result, they began offering more flexible mortgage options to everyday buyers. For the first time, middle-class families could purchase homes without needing the entire amount up front. This shift had a huge impact on who could become a homeowner and how fast neighborhoods could grow. Typical mortgages in the 1920s were not like the ones we see today. Loans were often for 5 to 10 years, with a large payment due at the end. Monthly payments mostly went toward interest, and the expectation was that the borrower would refinance when the loan matured. There were no federal guarantees and no institutions like the FHA to back loans. Borrowers had to prove they were stable and trustworthy, and lenders carried real risk. Despite the limitations, this access to credit changed the housing market. More people could afford homes, which increased demand. Builders could count on steady buyers. Banks saw mortgage lending as a reliable business. The entire system fed into itself, with more loans supporting more building and more building creating more loans. Installment plans also became popular during this time. Rather than paying for home improvements or furnishings all at once, buyers could spread payments over time. This approach aligned with the broader consumer culture of the decade. It was a time of buying on credit, and real estate was no exception. At the same time, land speculation thrived. People borrowed money to buy lots they never intended to live on, hoping to resell quickly at a profit. In some cases, entire developments were financed on speculation, with the assumption that rising prices would cover the debt. This was especially true in booming areas like Florida, where easy credit helped fuel a rush of unrealistic investment. The 1920s mortgage boom made homeownership possible for more Americans than ever before. But it also created new risks. As buyers borrowed more and lenders extended credit freely, the entire system became increasingly fragile. If prices fell or refinancing became difficult, many homeowners would find themselves in trouble. That vulnerability would become painfully clear by the end of the decade. In the mid-1920s, Florida became the hottest real estate market in the United States. What had once been considered swampy, remote, and underdeveloped land suddenly turned into one of the most talked about destinations in the country. Investors, retirees, and dreamers alike rushed to the state with hopes of sunshine, beachfront living, and fast profits. This frenzy would come to define one of the most dramatic land booms in American history. It started with advertising. Developers flooded northern newspapers with promises of paradise. Full-page spreads featured palm trees, Spanish-style villas, and serene coastlines. They claimed the future was in Florida: climate, beauty, and investment potential, all in one place. Even people who had never visited the state were convinced they needed to buy a piece of it. Train routes expanded to bring buyers in. Hotels and temporary housing filled up with eager speculators. In Miami, lots were bought and resold multiple times in a single day, often by people who had never even seen them. Land flipped hands so quickly that local governments struggled to keep up with the paperwork. Title offices were overwhelmed. Contracts were written on car hoods and cafe napkins. It wasn't just the wealthy buying in. Middle-class families poured their savings into tiny parcels of land, hoping to cash in. Some bought lots sight unseen, relying entirely on promotional brochures and word of mouth. Others visited briefly and made snap decisions. The idea was simple: buy now, sell later, and make a fortune. Entire towns were planned and sold out before a single building was constructed. Streets were drawn on maps that had no connection to the physical landscape. Developers promised amenities that never materialized. In some cases, land that was underwater or inaccessible was sold at high prices to outhave state buyers. The excitement over Florida real estate became more about momentum than reality. But the boom couldn't last forever. In 1925, cracks began to show. Shipping delays made it harder to bring in building materials. Railroad companies refused to carry construction goods during the height of the rush. Then came the 1926 hurricane that devastated Miami and surrounding areas. It destroyed thousands of buildings and killed the dream of easy, endless profits. By 1927, prices were collapsing. Projects were abandoned. Investors who came late lost everything. Florida's land boom had turned into a cautionary tale. What started as a vision of paradise ended in broken promises, legal battles, and bankruptcies. It would take years for the state's real estate market to recover. As real estate boomed across the United States, a new professional figure began to rise in visibility and importance: the real estate agent. While buying and selling property had always existed, the 1920s marked the start of real estate as a formalized career. This decade saw the beginnings of licensing requirements, association standards, and more sophisticated marketing techniques than ever before. Agents in the 1920s were part salesperson, part promoter, and part matchmaker. Their job was to connect buyers with property, often using persuasive language, bold promises, and a lot of optimism. Many agents worked directly for developers or banks, especially in large-scale subdivisions. Others operated independently, setting up shop in rapidly growing towns and suburbs where demand for housing was outpacing supply. Real estate offices became more common on main streets. Window displays showed available homes and land parcels, often featuring black and white photographs and hand-lettered signs. Agents relied heavily on print media to reach their audience. Newspaper classifieds were filled with housing listings, land offers, and open house announcements. These ads promised investment potential, lifestyle upgrades, and instant equity. Marketing wasn't subtle. Ads often played to emotion. Phrases like "live the good life," "own your dream," and "secure your family's future" were everywhere. Developers used patriotic themes, modern lifestyle appeals, and even fear to motivate buyers. Some campaigns emphasized the risk of missing out, pushing buyers to act quickly before prices rose even higher. Word of mouth was also a powerful tool. Happy buyers often brought in friends or relatives. Agents who delivered on promises could build trust and earn steady referrals. In tight-knit communities, reputation was everything. A trusted agent could become the go-to expert for an entire neighborhood. The professionalization of the field also began to take shape. In 1923, the National Association of Real Estate Boards introduced a code of ethics to guide conduct. This was a step toward creating consistency and credibility across the industry. While the code was not always followed, it signaled that real estate was becoming more than just a hustle. It was becoming a career. At the same time, barriers remained. Women were rare in the field, and many agencies excluded non-white clients entirely. Housing discrimination was not only common, but often baked directly into the marketing and sales process. The profession grew, but it did not grow equally. Still, the 1920s laid the groundwork for the real estate agent as a central figure in American home buying. While the 1920s offered new opportunities for many homebuyers, renters faced a very different reality. In large cities across the country, rents climbed sharply during and after World War I. With housing shortages and demand outpacing supply, landlords took advantage by raising prices quickly. Many working-class families found themselves unable to keep up. In New York City, frustration boiled over. Between 1918 and 1920, tenants in hundreds of buildings organized rent strikes. They refused to pay inflated rents and demanded better living conditions. The movement was led largely by women, especially immigrant mothers who were tired of overcrowded apartments and abusive landlords. They saw housing not just as shelter, but as a matter of dignity and survival. Tenants marched in the streets, picketed buildings, and filled courtrooms. In some cases, they won. New York passed its first rent control laws in response to this wave of activism. These laws limited how much landlords could raise rent and gave tenants new legal tools to defend themselves. Chicago saw similar unrest in the early 1920s. Renters held community meetings, printed flyers, and formed tenant unions. They worked together to expose slumlords and push for regulation. These early efforts set the stage for later housing movements and showed that tenants could organize and win protections. But it wasn't easy. Landlords retaliated by evicting strike leaders. Courts were often biased in favor of property owners. Many tenants lost their homes or were blacklisted. The legal system was slow to catch up to the growing demands for fairness. Even when laws were passed, enforcement was weak. Despite the risks, rent strikes spread awareness. They forced newspapers and politicians to pay attention to the housing crisis. They challenged the idea that real estate should only serve investors and owners. And they reminded the public that stable housing was essential for healthy communities. In some cities, strikes also brought different immigrant groups together. Italian, Jewish, Irish, and Black renters who might not have interacted otherwise stood side by side to challenge a system that was pricing them out. It was one of the first times in American history that tenants used collective action to demand rights. The tenant protests of the 1920s did not solve the housing crisis, but they shifted the conversation. They laid the groundwork for future rent laws, public housing efforts, and housing justice movements that would emerge decades later. They proved that even in an age of booming markets, not everyone could afford to play the game. While the 1920s offered new opportunities for many homebuyers, renters faced a very different reality. Rents climbed sharply during and after World War I, with housing shortages and demand outpacing supply. Landlords took advantage by raising prices quickly. Many working-class families found themselves unable to keep up. In New York City, frustration boiled over. Between 1918 and 1920, tenants in hundreds of buildings organized rent strikes. They refused to pay inflated rents and demanded better living conditions. The movement was led largely by women, especially immigrant mothers, who were tired of overcrowded apartments and abusive landlords. They saw housing not just as shelter, but as a matter of dignity and survival. Tenants marched in the streets, picketed buildings, and filled courtrooms. In some cases, they won. New York passed its first rent control laws in response to this wave of activism. These laws limited how much landlords could raise rent and gave tenants new legal tools to defend themselves. Chicago saw similar unrest in the early 1920s. Renters held community meetings, printed flyers, and formed tenant unions. They worked together to expose slumlords and push for regulation. These early efforts set the stage for later housing movements and showed that tenants could organize and win protections. But it wasn't easy. Landlords retaliated by evicting strike leaders. Courts were often biased in favor of property owners. Many tenants lost their homes or were blacklisted. The legal system was slow to catch up to the growing demands for fairness. Even when laws were passed, enforcement was weak. Despite the risks, rent strikes spread awareness. They forced newspapers and politicians to pay attention to the housing crisis. They challenged the idea that real estate should only serve investors and owners. And they reminded the public that stable housing was essential for healthy communities. In some cities, strikes also brought different immigrant groups together. Italian, Jewish, Irish, and Black renters, who might not have interacted otherwise, stood side by side to challenge a system that was pricing them out. It was one of the first times in American history that tenants used collective action to demand rights. The tenant protests of the 1920s did not solve the housing crisis, but they shifted the conversation. They laid the groundwork for future rent laws, public housing efforts, and housing justice movements that would emerge decades later. They proved that even in an age of booming markets, not everyone could afford to play the game. By the end of the 1920s, cracks were forming beneath the surface of the real estate market. Prices had risen too fast, too far, and on too much borrowed money. Speculation had outpaced reality. In cities across the country, especially in the South and along the coasts, neighborhoods stood half-finished, with streets that led nowhere and lots that never saw a foundation poured. Florida had already shown signs of what could go wrong. After the land boom collapsed, buyers who had paid top dollar were left holding worthless property. But the problems weren't limited to Florida. Overbuilding was happening in Chicago, New York, Los Angeles, and dozens of smaller cities. Developers had counted on endless growth. When demand slowed, they were left with debt they couldn't repay. Banks began to tighten lending. Refinancing became harder. Those short-term balloon mortgages that had helped so many buyers now came due, and many couldn't afford the final payment. Defaults rose, so did foreclosures. Families who had once felt secure in their new homes were suddenly being evicted. In 1929, the stock market crashed. It hit Wall Street first, but the shockwaves moved quickly through every sector, including real estate. Construction stopped. Property values dropped. Within just a few years, the value of homes in some cities had fallen by as much as 50 to 70%. Investment property was especially hard hit. Rental incomes dropped while mortgage payments stayed the same, driving owners into bankruptcy. Many banks had been deeply tied to real estate. When property owners defaulted, the banks began to fail too. The collapse of both housing and finance created a downward spiral. Builders went out of business. Real estate offices closed. Entire developments were abandoned. In some cities, houses sat empty and unfinished, reminders of a dream that had vanished. The crash also exposed the fragile nature of the housing system. There were no federal protections for homeowners, no safety nets, no systems to help families restructure debt or prevent foreclosure. The entire housing economy had been built on confidence, and once that confidence disappeared, the system broke down. The Great Depression that followed forced a national reckoning. It became clear that unchecked speculation, weak regulation, and easy credit had created a bubble that was never built to last. Real estate, once seen as the safest bet in America, was suddenly a symbol of loss, broken promises, and vanished wealth. The collapse of the 1920s real estate boom left a lasting mark on the American landscape. Not just in the physical ruins of half-finished neighborhoods, but in the policies and institutions that followed. It became clear that housing, like the stock market, needed guardrails. The belief that real estate could only go up had been shattered. What came next was a fundamental shift in how the United States thought about homeownership, regulation, and economic responsibility. During the 1930s, the federal government stepped in to reshape the housing system. Programs like the Homeowners Loan Corporation helped struggling families refinance their mortgages. The creation of the Federal Housing Administration offered insurance on loans, encouraging banks to lend more confidently and on better terms. These changes laid the groundwork for the long-term fixed-rate mortgage that would become the standard in decades to come. Zoning laws also expanded during this time. Cities began creating more structured plans for land use, separating residential, commercial, and industrial areas. This helped organize growth, but also reinforce social divisions. Wealthy neighborhoods used zoning to keep out apartment buildings, rental housing, and people considered undesirable. It was a new kind of control, dressed up in the language of planning and order. The 1920s also taught a lesson about speculation. Easy money, unchecked enthusiasm, and loose lending had created a market that looked strong but was hollow inside. Policymakers, economists, and the public began to understand that real estate was not just a local concern. It could affect the entire economy. For tenants, the strikes and protests of the 1920s were not forgotten. They set a precedent for rent control, public housing programs, and the idea that housing was more than just a commodity. It was a right, or at least something society had a role in protecting. Later movements would build on these early efforts, fighting for affordable housing, fair lending, and anti-discrimination laws. The decade also shaped the cultural meaning of home, became more than shelter. It was a symbol of success, stability, and belonging. Advertisers and policymakers alike pushed the idea that every family should own a house. This ideal would influence American life well beyond the 20th century. The real estate story of the 1920s is not just a historical chapter. It is a mirror. It shows how ambition, inequality, hope, and risk can all be built into the walls of a house. It reminds us that housing is never just about land and buildings. It is about people, systems, and the stories we choose to believe.